think it's a good time to consider one of the great founding fathers and to think through the principles of the American Republic and the American experiment from that vantage point. That might give us some solace, I hope. So Benjamin Franklin is really one of the most extraordinary people in history. More than any other person, he created the American type, earning the title of the first American, the epitome of the self-made man, rising from a lowly social position to the first circle. So stories such as his and Alexander Hamilton's were not the norm among the founders. Yet Franklin became the most consequential of the founding fathers along with George Washington. He was born in 1706, lived a long life, dying in 1790. He was the 15th of 17 children of his father Josiah by two wives. After the first had died, Josiah married again. Josiah had immigrated from England, so we're talking about newly arrived Americans. Josiah was a candle and soap maker, so this is from the lower, the artisan class. Benjamin Franklin was born on Milk Street in Boston and was christened in the Old South Meeting House across the street from his birthplace. Unfortunately, that house doesn't stand right now. There's a nice building there, but not the original structure. Ben had less schooling than the other founders, though he became as learned as any. He had 2 years at the Boston Latin School, didn't graduate because the education fund, as it were, ran out. Because of his bookishness, it had originally been thought that he might be fit for the clergy, that would be an appropriate place for him to go, but the circumstances forced a life in the trades. So he was apprenticed. Indeed, he was indentured to his brother James, who was a printer, and he learned the printing trade from his brother. As he was indentured and had chafed under his brother's imperiousness as a master, Ben ran away to Philadelphia at the age of 17. Before that, though, I should note that James had published one of the first newspapers in the colonies, the New England Courant, and in fact had gotten into trouble for a piece that was critical of the colonial governor. So Ben had saw up close the necessity of freedom of the press, literally of the press, and James was in fact imprisoned for this exercising such liberty, and Ben came to his defense publicly, of course, and this is part of what was in his deepest convictions. After he ran away to Philadelphia, he soon thereafter he had caught the notice of the colonial governor there, William Keith, who was an interesting man who liked to be liked, but did not have really the means to advance people, but promised the means. So he had promised Ben the ability to set up his own printing business, and had supposedly given him letters to that effect to take to England. When he got to England, Ben found that these letters were worthless, and he was kind of stuck there. So he learned his trade very well in two printing houses there. On his way back, he conceived his plan for moral perfection, which is the reading we have before us. So the selection is part 2 of his autobiography. And this plan he conceived at I think he wasn't even 20 years old. So that's interesting. In 1727, Franklin, when he was 21, formed and there's dispute over how to pronounce this. I'm going to go with the guess that they were Latinate in their thinking, the Junto, or Junto as we would pronounce it, a cabal of learning. It was 12 members who met weekly to discuss ideas. It was a great conversation kind of group, a very beautiful project. It was, in fact, the basis for the American Philosophical Society. From that gathering, they realized that they wanted access to more books, and Franklin came up with the idea of a subscription library. So that was the core of really the first public library in America. In 1728, he set up his own printing house with a partner, And then he started to publish a new newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. The printing, publishing, and then later his being head of the postal system of Franklin allowed him to set up the communications infrastructure necessary to forge an American identity. It's hard to overestimate how important his handling of these means of publicity, as the Enlightenment word is, the virtue of being able to create a reading public and then to supply that need with materials to read, like magazines and newspapers. The colonies actually had a higher rate of literacy than perhaps anywhere else in the world. Certainly New England's literacy was perhaps 70%. That had to do with the religious nature of that colony, of say the Massachusetts colony in particular, because the need to study the scriptures on one's own incentivized the spreading of general literacy. This, even in as the decades went on and that original Puritan commitment waned, the high level of literacy was continued, and Franklin was there to meet that need, and in fact to augment it by creating really a very effective postal service. He was friends with George Whitefield, who was the force behind the Great Awakening, and indeed was his publisher. So that's fascinating because, of course, as we'll discuss today, Franklin was not a conventional Christian. He was a deist. And in fact, he was a friend of, say, David Hume. So here's a man who was able to be friends with Whitefield on the one hand and Hume on the other. That gives you a sense of his capaciousness. He was elected to be clerk of the Pennsylvania General Assembly in 1736. And part of the history of Pennsylvania that's worth noting is that it had been given to the Penn family, William Penn, as an absolute proprietorship, meaning it was actually the personal possession of the Penn family. And the growing pains of the early mid 1700s was that Philadelphia, which was still small when Franklin got there when he was 17, it was the second largest city in the colonies, and would become, in fact, the first and the first city of the colonies by the time of the Revolution. So the growing pains of Pennsylvania involved wresting control away from the Penn family, and in that struggle, Franklin was very important. But before that came to a head, which came to a head basically about the time the Revolution broke out, he was made the secretary, as it were, of the General Assembly of Pennsylvania. And that also was of great help for his printing business, because that means he took the notes and he published them. So he was very entrepreneurial. He secured contracts, say, for paper money in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So he knew how to hustle, and he knew how to be still somehow of great social utility in his hustling. He was the first U.S. ambassador to France, and he secured that material aid in munitions and such from France, without which we could not have won the Revolutionary War. So that was profoundly important, that his ability to be a man of great persuasion. He was there actually one of the three members of the drafting committee for the Declaration of Independence, along with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And of course, he was one of the founding fathers that was both in that Congress, but also in the Constitutional Convention in around 1789. So that was, he was consequential through many decades. He was governor of Pennsylvania from 1785 to 1788. He had made enough money in the work he did as a printer and publisher he was very wealthy by the time he could retire in his early 40s and become a gentleman, right? One who did not have to work. And he was sent to England to discuss actually Massachusetts's concerns about our colonial governor, Thomas Hutchinson, at the time. And he was dressed down by the Solicitor General, Wedderburn, and humiliated. And Franklin took that, but that actually helped catalyze him into support for the revolution. He was not a man who liked conflict, but if you gave him a motive, he was definitely willing to follow through. When he presented himself at the French court, instead of trying to fit in with the culture, he in fact presented himself as like Poor Richard, right? The simple American. And that endeared him to the French. His deism is something we will talk about, but we want to note that this distinction he makes in the writings between faith and works, basically between dogma and doing something practical for the service of humanity. That's a division we're going to see in the history of Christianity. What is termed liberal Christianity is that thought that carries on the rational religiosity that is the Enlightenment religiosity, that is Franklin's religiosity. And it's something we want to think about. Here's a man who's serious, very much in earnest about virtue, but he's trying to do that without the benefit of a revealed religious tradition. Deism, of course, is this belief that God exists, that he has a general providence, but that he isn't worried about the particulars. He isn't micromanaging, and he doesn't reveal something special to one group that he doesn't reveal to all. Our rationality is able to read off what is essential from nature. And that's the kind of belief that Franklin had. That said, he was serious about maintaining that much religiosity. It wasn't an esoteric thing where he was really not a believer in God. He believed in God. He found that, in fact, when he was more free thinking, he found that those of his friends, he would later say, basically, he corrupted them with free thinking. He found that those friends became not very good friends. And so he was convinced of the necessity of religion. He certainly tolerated any of the revealed religions, and he wanted them all to live peaceably. But he himself only believed in this rational religion of good works. And one question to ask is, can one be committed to a program of virtue over the long run? Can a culture be committed to virtue, the pursuit of happiness as a matter of virtue, without the benefits of a particular religion? That is, things like the Dogmas of Trinity. That's why the deists were always Unitarian, right? Trinity is a very specific revealed doctrine, or of course the divinity of Christ. That's the incarnation. That these are specific doctrines that aren't publicly available. They're only known if revealed. He wrote once, "I think vital religion has always suffered when orthodoxy is more regarded than virtue. And the scripture assures me that at the last day, we shall not be examined what we thought, but what we did." Part of this, of course, this is the old story that the Enlightenment is trying to break the monopoly that priests or clerics and general ministers and theologians have on society, really. He is the one who advances literacy for everyone. He wants everyone to have that ability to be active based on their apprehension of what is so. Benjamin Franklin is the one who certainly for America, but in a way for the world, takes all of these great the printing press and Enlightenment publicity and puts it into effect in a way that no other single person really manages to do. He really is a universal kind of man. In the introduction that I've got for the reading, you can see the famous kite experiment, of course, is to prove that what's there in lightning is actually electricity and so on. He was a real contributor to the scientific revolution, and he invented things. He invented the glass harmonica, for which both Beethoven and Mozart composed pieces and so on. But you can take a look at that. We will now, I think, turn to the questions. Number one, Franklin read Plutarch's Lives assiduously. Benjamin Vaughan, in that one of the prefacing letters to this selection we've got, urges Franklin to publish his autobiography because it will teach others the means to the end of a happy life. Has knowledge of the conduct of another person's life affected how you live your life? I think that it's worth our thinking about how the exemplarity of another person has perhaps affected us. 2, can frugality and industry render circumstances of origin irrelevant for how successful one becomes? If this might have been so for certain Western European men in the early Wild West days of our commercial republic, is it still the case in today's America? How self-made can we be? A basic kind of critique, because the optimism of the early days of America, which Lincoln still possessed, right? The thought, and Hamilton is there to embody the thought that you can come from lowly origins, as those three men did, and make it in the world. They certainly showed that that was possible then. Of course, they were white men, and that's part of the question here. And then, is it still the case now? Do we have those conditions in America? And if not, what can we do to make it possible for everybody's powers to unfold in this beautiful way? Number 3, is a tolerant, undogmatic, deistic religiosity enough to sustain a morality of virtue? Does Franklin's criticism of his Presbyterian minister have merit from the passage we've got? Does dogma necessarily contract religion's rationality, universality, and philanthropy? Again, we have this example of the wars of religion between Protestants and Catholics, and we've seen, and before that, just the horrendous persecution, whenever it happened, of heretics, that in fact, things that if you just look at it as a human being and say, well, you don't kill people because they don't believe something. It's very basic. And so the question is it the case that dogma poisons us, or is it that we just don't know how to handle dogma? And question 4, does Franklin's art of virtue present a method attractive and useful to you? Does his sequencing of the virtues seem reasonable? Should we strive for virtue even if it doesn't make